Chapter 59 of Don Quixote, Volume 2. Chapter 59, wherein is related the strange thing which may be regarded as an adventure that happened Don Quixote. A clear, limpid spring which they discovered in a cool grove relieved Don Quixote and Sancho of the dust and fatigue due to the unpolite behavior of the bulls. And by the side of this, having turned Dapple and Rocinante loose without headstall or bridle, the forlorn pair, master and man, seated themselves. Sancho had recourse to the larder of his alforjas, and took out of them what he called the prog. Don Quixote rinsed his mouth and bathed his face, by which cooling process his flagging energies were revived. Out of pure vexation he remained without eating, and out of pure politeness Sancho did not venture to touch a morsel of what was before him, but waited for his master to act as taster. Seeing, however, that, absorbed in thought, he was forgetting to carry the bread to his mouth, he never said a word, and trampling every sort of good breeding underfoot, began to stow away in his paunch the bread and cheese that came to his hand. "Eat, Sancho, my friend," said Don Quixote. "Support life, which is of more consequence to thee than to me, and leave me to die under the pain of my thoughts and pressure of my misfortunes. I was born, Sancho, to live dying, and thou to die eating. And to prove the truth of what I say, look at me, printed in histories, famed in arms, courteous in behaviour, honoured by princes, courted by maidens, and after all, when I looked forward to palms, triumphs, and crowns, won and earned by my valiant deeds, I have this morning seen myself trampled on, kicked, and crushed by the feet of unclean and filthy animals. This thought blunts my teeth, paralyzes my jaws, cramps my hands, and robs me of all appetite for food, so much so that I have a mind to let myself die of hunger, the cruelest death of all deaths." "So then," said Sancho, munching hard all the time, "your worship does not agree with the proverb that says, 'Let Martha die, but let her die with a full belly.' I, at any rate, have no mind to kill myself. So far from that, I mean to do as the cobbler does, who stretches the leather with his teeth until he makes it reach as far as he wants. I'll stretch out my life by eating until it reaches the end heaven has fixed for it, and let me tell you, señor, there's no greater folly than to think of dying of despair as your worship does. Take my advice, and after eating, lie down and sleep a bit on this green grass mattress, and you will see that when you awake you'll feel something better." Don Quixote did as he recommended, for it struck him that Sancho's reasoning was more like a philosopher's than a blockhead's, and said he, "Sancho, if thou wilt do for me what I am going to tell thee, my ease of mind would be more assured and my heaviness of heart not so great. And it is this: to go aside a little while I am sleeping, in accordance with thy advice, and making bare thy carcass to the air, to give thyself 300 or 400 lashes with Rocinante's reins, on account of the 3,000 and odd thou art to give thyself for the disenchantment of Dulcinea. For it is a great pity that the poor lady should be left enchanted through thy carelessness and negligence." "There is a good deal to be said on that point," said Sancho. "Let us both go to sleep now, and after that God has decreed what will happen. Let me tell your worship that for a man to whip himself in cold blood is a hard thing, especially if the stripes fall upon an ill-nourished and worse-fed body. Let my lady Dulcinea have patience, and when she is least expecting it, she will see me made a riddle of with whipping, and until death it's all life. I mean that I have still life in me, and the desire to make good what I have promised." Don Quixote thanked him, and ate a little, and Sancho a good deal, and then they both lay down to sleep, leaving those two inseparable friends and comrades, Rocinante and Dapple, to their own devices and to feed unrestrained upon the abundant grass with which the meadow was furnished. They woke up rather late, mounted once more, and resumed their journey, pushing on to reach an inn which was in sight, apparently a league off. I say an inn because Don Quixote called it so, contrary to his usual practice of calling all inns castles. They reached it and asked the landlord if they could put up there. He said yes, with as much comfort and as good fare as they could find in Saragossa. They dismounted, and Sancho stowed away his larder in a room of which the landlord gave him the key. He took the beasts to the stable, fed them, and came back to see what orders Don Quixote, who was seated on a bench at the door, had for him, giving special thanks to heaven that this inn had not been taken for a castle by his master. Supper time came, and they repaired to their room, and Sancho asked the landlord what he had to give them for supper. To this the landlord replied that his mouth should be the measure, he had only to ask what he would. For that inn was provided with the birds of the air and the fowls of the earth and the fish of the sea. "There's no need of all that," said Sancho. "If they'll roast us a couple of chickens we'll be satisfied, for my master is delicate and eats little, and I'm not over and above gluttonous." The landlord replied he had no chickens, for the kites had stolen them. "Well then," said Sancho, "let Señor Landlord tell them to roast a pullet, so that it is a tender one." "Pullet? My father!" said the landlord. "Indeed and in truth it's only yesterday I sent over 50 to the city to sell, but saving pullets ask what you will." "In that case," said Sancho, "you will not be without veal or kid." "Just now," said the landlord, "there's none in the house, for it's all finished, but next week there will be enough and to spare." "Much good that does us," said Sancho. "I'll lay a bet that all these shortcomings are going to wind up in plenty of bacon and eggs." "By God," said the landlord, "my guest's wits must be precious dull. I tell him I have neither pullets nor hens, and he wants me to have eggs. Talk of other dainties, if you please, and don't ask for hens again." "Body o' me," said Sancho, "let's settle the matter. Say at once what you have got, and let us have no more words about it." "In truth and earnest, señor guest," said the landlord, "all I have is a couple of cow heels, like calves' feet, or a couple of calves' feet like cow heels. They are boiled with chickpeas, onions, and bacon, and at this moment they are crying, 'Come eat me! Come eat me!'" "I marked them for mine on the spot," said Sancho. "Let nobody touch them. I'll pay better for them than anyone else, for I could not wish for anything more to my taste, and I don't care a pin whether they are feet or heels." "Nobody shall touch them," said the landlord, "for the other guests I have, being persons of high quality, bring their own cook and caterer and larder with them." "If you come to people of quality," said Sancho, "there's nobody more so than my master, but the calling he follows does not allow of larders or storerooms. We lay ourselves down in the middle of a meadow and fill ourselves with acorns or medlars." Here ended Sancho's conversation with the landlord, Sancho not caring to carry it any farther by answering him, for he had already asked him what calling or what profession it was his master was of. Supper time having come, then, Don Quixote betook himself to his room, the landlord brought in the stewpan just as it was, and he sat himself down to sup very resolutely. It seems that in another room, which was next to Don Quixote's, with nothing but a thin partition to separate it, he overheard these words: "As you live, Señor Don Jerónimo, while they are bringing supper, let us read another chapter of the second part of Don Quixote of La Mancha." The instant Don Quixote heard his own name, he started to his feet and listened with open ears to catch what they said about him, and heard the Don Hieronymo who had been addressed say in reply, "Why would you have us read that absurd stuff, Don Juan, when it is impossible for anyone who has read the first part of the history of Don Quixote of La Mancha to take any pleasure in reading this second part?" "For all that," said he who was addressed as Don Juan, "we shall do well to read it, for there is no book so bad but it has something good in it. What displeases me most in it is that it represents Don Quixote as now cured of his love for Dulcinea del Toboso." On hearing this, Don Quixote, full of wrath and indignation, lifted up his voice and said, "Whoever he may be who says that Don Quixote of La Mancha has forgotten or can forget Dulcinea del Toboso, I will teach him with equal arms that what he says is very far from the truth. For neither can the peerless Dulcinea del Toboso be forgotten, nor can forgetfulness have a place in Don Quixote. His motto is constancy, and his profession to maintain the same with his life and never wrong it." "Who is this that answers us?" said they in the next room. "Who should it be," said Sancho, "but Don Quixote of La Mancha himself, who will make good all he has said and all he will say, for pledges don't trouble a good payer." Sancho had hardly uttered these words when two gentlemen, for such they seemed to be, entered the room, and one of them, throwing his arms around Don Quixote's neck, said to him, "Your appearance cannot leave any question as to your name, nor can your name fail to identify your appearance. Unquestionably, señor, you are the real Don Quixote of La Mancha, cynosure and morning star of knight-errantry, despite and in defiance of him who has sought to usurp your name and bring to naught your achievements, as the author of this book which I here present to you has done." And with this he put a book which his companion carried into the hands of Don Quixote, who took it, and without replying began to run his eye over it. But he presently returned it, saying, "In the little I have seen, I have discovered 3 things in this author that deserve to be censured. The first is some words that I have read in the preface. The next, that the language is Aragonese, for sometimes he writes without articles. And the third, which above all stamps him as ignorant, is that he goes wrong and departs from the truth in the most important part of the history. For here he says that my squire, Sancho Panza's wife, is called Marie Gutierrez, when she is called nothing of the sort, but Teresa Panza, and when a man errs on such an important point as this, there is good reason to fear that he is in error on every other point in the history." "A nice sort of historian indeed!" exclaimed Sancho at this. "He must know a good deal about our affairs when he calls my wife Teresa Panza Marie Gutierrez. Take the book again, señor, and see if I am in it and if he has changed my name." "From your talk, friend," said Don Hieronymo, "no doubt you are Sancho Panza, Señor Don Quixote's squire." "Yes, I am," said Sancho, "and I'm proud of it." "Faith, then," said the gentleman, "this new author does not handle you with the decency that displays itself in your person. He makes you out a heavy feeder and a fool, and not in the least droll, and a very different being from the Sancho described in the first part of your master's history." "God forgive him," said Sancho. "He might have left me in my corner without troubling his head about me. Let him who knows how ring the bells, St. Peter is very well in Rome." The two gentlemen pressed Don Quixote to come into their room and have supper with them, as they knew very well there was nothing in that inn fit for one of his sort. Don Quixote, who was always polite, yielded to their request and supped with them. Sancho stayed behind with the stew, and invested with plenary delegated authority seated himself at the head of the table, and the landlord sat down with him, for he was no less fond of cow-heel and calves' feet than Sancho was. While at supper Don Juan asked Don Quixote what news he had of the lady Dulcinea del Toboso. Was she married? Had she been brought to bed, or was she with child, or did she in maidenhood, still preserving her modesty and delicacy, cherish the remembrance of the tender passion of Señor Don Quixote? To this he replied, "Dulcinea is a maiden still, and my passion more firmly rooted than ever, our intercourse unsatisfactory as before, and her beauty transformed into that of a foul country wench." And then he proceeded to give them a full and particular account of the enchantment of Dulcinea, and of what had happened him in the cave of Montesinos, together with what the sage Merlin had prescribed for her disenchantment, namely the scourging of Sancho. Exceedingly great was the amusement the two gentlemen derived from hearing Don Quixote recount the strange incidents of his history, and if they were amazed by his absurdities, they were equally amazed by the elegant style in which he delivered them. On the one hand they regarded him as a man of wit and sense, and on the other he seemed to them a maundering blockhead, and they should not make up their minds whereabouts between wisdom and folly they ought to place him. Sancho, having finished his supper and left the landlord in the X condition, repaired to the room where his master was, and as he came in said, "May I die, sir, if the author of this book your worships have got has any mind that we should agree, as he calls me glutton, according to what your worships say. I wish he may not call me drunkard too." "But he does," said Don Jeronimo. "I cannot remember, however, in what way, though I know his words are offensive, and what is more, lying, as I can see plainly by the physiognomy of the worthy Sancho before me." "Believe me," said Sancho, "the Sancho and the Don Quixote of this history must be different persons from those that appear in the one Cide Hamete Benengeli wrote. Who are ourselves? My master valiant, wise, and true in love, and I simple, droll, and neither glutton nor drunkard." "I believe it," said Don Juan, "and were it possible, an order should be issued that no one should have the presumption to deal with anything relating to Don Quixote, save his original author Cide Hamete, just as Alexander commanded that no one should presume to paint his portrait save Apelles." "Let him who will paint me," said Don Quixote, "but let him not abuse me, for patience will often break down when they heap insults upon it." "None can be offered to Señor Don Quixote," said Don Juan, "that he himself will not be able to avenge, if he does not ward it off with the shield of his patience, which, I take it, is great and strong." A considerable portion of the night passed in conversation of this sort, and though Don Juan wished Don Quixote to read more of the book to see what it was all about, he was not to be prevailed upon, saying that he treated it as read and pronounced it utterly silly, and if by any chance it should come to its author's ears that he had it in his hand, he did not want him to flatter himself with the idea that he had read it, for our thoughts, and still more our eyes, should keep themselves aloof from what is obscene and filthy. They asked him whither he meant to direct his steps. He replied to Saragossa, to take part in the harness jousts which were held in that city every year. Don Juan told him that the new history described how Don Quixote, let him be who he might, took part there in a tilting at the ring, utterly devoid of invention, poor in mottos, very poor in costume, though rich in silliness. "For that very reason," said Don Quixote, "I will not set foot in Saragossa, and by that means I shall expose to the world the lie of this new history writer, and people will see that I am not the Don Quixote he speaks of." "You will do quite right," said Don Jeronimo, "and there are other jousts at Barcelona in which Señor Don Quixote may display his prowess." "That is what I mean to do," said Don Quixote, "and as it is now time, I pray your worships to give me leave to retire to bed, and to place and retain me among the number of your greatest friends and servants." "And me too," said Sancho. Maybe I'll be good for something." With this they exchanged farewells, and Don Quixote and Sancho retired to their room, leaving Don Juan and Don Jeronimo amazed to see the medley he made of his good sense and his craziness; and they felt thoroughly convinced that these, and not those their Aragonese author described, were the genuine Don Quixote and Sancho. Don Quixote rose betimes, and bade adieu to his hosts by knocking at the partition of the other room. Sancho paid the landlord magnificently, and recommended him either to say less about the providing of his inn, or to keep it better provided. End of chapter 59.
Chapter 60 of Don Quixote, Volume 2. Chapter 60 of what happened Don Quixote on his way to Barcelona. It was a fresh morning, giving promise of a cool day as Don Quixote quitted the inn, first of all taking care to ascertain the most direct road to Barcelona without touching upon Saragossa, so anxious was he to make out this new historian, whom they said abused him so, to be a liar. Well, as it fell out, nothing worthy of being recorded happened him for 6 days, at the end of which, having turned aside out of the road, he was overtaken by night in a thicket of oak or cork trees, for on this point Cide Amante is not as precise as he usually is on other matters. Master and man dismounted from their beasts, and as soon as they had settled themselves at the foot of the trees, Sancho, who had had a good noontide meal that day, let himself, without more ado, pass the gates of sleep. But Don Quixote, whom his thoughts, far more than hunger, kept awake, could not close an eye, and roamed in fancy to and fro through all sorts of places. At one moment it seemed to him that he was in the cave of Montesinos, and saw Dulcinea, transformed into a country wench, skipping and mounting upon her she-ass; again that the words of the sage Merlin were sounding in his ears, setting forth the conditions to be observed and the exertions to be made for the disenchantment of Dulcinea. He lost all patience when he considered the laziness and want of charity of his squire Sancho, for, to the best of his belief, he had only given himself 5 lashes, a number paltry and disproportioned to the vast number required. At this thought he felt such vexation and anger that he reasoned the matter thus: if Alexander the Great cut the Gordian knot, saying to cut comes to the same thing as to untie, and yet did not fail to become Lord Paramount of all Asia, neither more nor less could happen now in Dulcinea's disenchantment if I scourge Sancho against his will. For if it is the condition of the remedy that Sancho shall receive 3,000 and odd lashes, what does it matter to me whether he inflicts them himself or someone else inflicts them, when the essential point is that he receives them, let them come from whatever quarter they may? With this idea he went over to Sancho, having first taken Rocinante's reins, and arranged them so as to be able to flog him with them, and began to untie the points (the common belief is that he had but one in front) by which his breeches were held up. But the instant he approached him, Sancho woke up in his full senses and cried out, "What is this? Who is touching me and untrussing me?" "It is I," said Don Quixote, "and I come to make good thy shortcomings and relieve my own distresses. I come to whip thee, Sancho, and wipe off some of the portion of the debt thou hast undertaken. Dulcinea is perishing. Thou art living on regardless. I am dying of hope deferred. Therefore untrust thyself with a good will, for mine it is, here, in this retired spot, to give thee at least 2,000 lashes." "Not a bit of it," said Sancho. "Let your worship keep quiet, or else, by the living God, the deaf shall hear us. The lashes I pledged myself to must be voluntary and not forced upon me, and just now I have no fancy to whip myself. It is enough if I give you my word to flog and flap myself when I have a mind." "It will not do to leave it to thy courtesy, Sancho," said Don Quixote, "for thou art hard of heart, and though a clown, tender of flesh." And at the same time he strove and struggled to untie him. Seeing this, Sancho got up, and, grappling with his master, he gripped him with all his might in his arms, giving him a trip with the heel, stretched him on the ground on his back, and pressing his right knee on his chest, held his hands in his own, so that he could neither move nor breathe. "How now, traitor!" exclaimed Don Quixote. "Dost thou revolt against thy master and natural lord? Dost thou rise against him who gives thee his bread?" "I neither put down king nor set up king," said Sancho. "I only stand up for myself, who am my own lord. If your worship promises me to be quiet, and not to offer to whip me now, I'll let you go free and unhindered. If not, traitor and Doña Sanchez, foe, thou diest on the spot." Don Quixote gave his promise, and swore by the life of his thoughts not to touch so much as a hair of his garments, and to leave him entirely free, and to his own discretion to whip himself whenever he pleased. Sancho rose and removed some distance from the spot, but as he was about to place himself leaning against another tree, he felt something touch his head, and putting up his hands encountered somebody's 2 feet with shoes and stockings on them. He trembled with fear, and made for another tree, where the very same thing happened to him, and he fell a-shouting, calling upon Don Quixote to come and protect him. Don Quixote did so, and asked him what had happened to him, and what he was afraid of. Sancho replied that all the trees were full of men's feet and legs. Don Quixote felt them, and guessed at once what it was, and said to Sancho, "Thou hast nothing to be afraid of, for these feet and legs that thou feelest but canst not see belong no doubt to some outlaws and freebooters that have been hanged on these trees, for the authorities in these parts are wont to hang them up by 20s and 30s when they catch them, whereby I conjecture that I must be near Barcelona." And it was, in fact, as he supposed. With the first light they looked up and saw that the fruit hanging on those trees were freebooters' bodies. And now day dawned, and if the dead freebooters had scared them, their hearts were no less troubled by upwards of 40 living ones, who all of a sudden surrounded them, and in the Catalan tongue bade them stand and wait until their captain came up. Don Quixote was on foot, with his horse unbridled, and his lance leaning against a tree, and in short, completely defenceless. He thought it best, therefore, to fold his arms and bow his head and reserve himself for a more favorable occasion and opportunity. The robbers made haste to search Dapple, and did not leave him a single thing of all he carried in the forjas and in the valise, and luckily it was for Sancho that the Duke's crowns and those he brought from home were in a girdle that he wore around him. But for all that, these good folk would have stripped him, and even looked to see what he had hidden between the skin and flesh, but for the arrival at that moment of their captain, who was about 34 years of age apparently, strongly built, above the middle height, of stern aspect and swarthy complexion. He was mounted upon a powerful horse, and had on a coat of mail, with 4 of the pistols they call petronels in that country, at his waist. He saw that his squires, for so they call those who follow that trade, were about to rifle Sancho Panza, but he ordered them to desist, and was at once obeyed, so the girdle escaped. He wondered to see the lance leaning against the tree, the shield on the ground, and Don Quixote in armor and dejected, with the saddest and most melancholy face that sadness itself could produce. And going up to him, he said, "Be not so cast down, good man, for you have not fallen into the hands of any inhuman busiris, but into Roque Guenards, which are more merciful than cruel." "The cause of my dejection," returned Don Quixote, "is not that I have fallen into thy hands, O valiant Roque, whose fame is bounded by no limits on earth, but that my carelessness should have been so great that thy soldiers should have caught me unbridled, when it is my duty, according to the rule of knight-errantry which I profess, to be always on the alert, and at all times my own sentinel, For let me tell thee, great Roque, had they found me on my horse with my lance and shield, it would not have been very easy for them to reduce me to submission, for I am Don Quixote of La Mancha, he who hath filled the whole world with his achievements. Roque Guinart at once perceived that Don Quixote's weakness was more akin to madness than to swagger, and though he had sometimes heard him spoken of, he never regarded the things attributed to him as true, nor could he persuade himself that such a humor could become dominant in the heart of man. He was extremely glad, therefore, to meet him and test at close quarters what he had heard of him at a distance. So he said to him, "Despair not, valiant knight, nor regard as an untoward fate the position in which thou findest thyself. It may be that by these slips thy crooked fortune will make itself straight, for heaven, by strange circuitous ways, mysterious and incomprehensible to men, rises up the fallen and makes the rich poor." Don Quixote was about to thank him when they heard behind them a noise of a troop of horses. There was, however, but one, riding on which at a furious pace came a youth, apparently about 20 years of age, clad in green damask edged with gold and breeches and a loose frock, with a hat looped up in the Walloon fashion, tight-fitting polished boots, gilt spurs, dagger and sword, and in his hand a musketoon and a pair of pistols at his waist. Roque turned around at the noise and perceived this comely figure, which, drawing near, thus addressed him. "I came in quest of thee, valiant Roque, to find in thee, if not a remedy, at least relief in my misfortune. And not to keep thee in suspense, for I see thou dost not recognize me, I will tell thee who I am. I am Claudia Hieronima, the daughter of Simon Forte, thy good friend, and special enemy of Cloquel Torrellas, who is thine also, as being of the faction opposed to thee. Thou knowest that this Torrellas has a son who is called, or at least was not 2 hours since, Don Vicente Torrellas. Well, to cut short the tale of my misfortune, I will tell thee in a few words what this youth has brought upon me. He saw me, he paid court to me, I listened to him, and, unknown to my father, I loved him. For there is no woman, however secluded she may live, or close she may be kept, who will not have opportunities and to spare for following her headlong impulses. In a word, he pledged himself to be mine, and I promised to be his, without carrying matters any further. Yesterday I learned that, forgetful of his pledge to me, he was about to marry another, and that he was to go this morning to plight his troth, intelligence which overwhelmed and exasperated me. My father not being at home, I was able to adopt this costume, you see, and urging my horse to speed, I overtook Don Vicente about a league from this, and without waiting to utter reproaches or hear excuses, I fired this musket at him, and these 2 pistols besides, and to the best of my belief I must have lodged more than 2 bullets in his body, opening doors to let my honor go free, enveloped in his blood. I left him there in the hands of his servants, who did not dare and were not able to interfere in his defense, and I come to seek from thee a safe conduct into France, where I have relatives with whom I can live, and also to implore thee to protect my father, so that Don Vicente's numerous kinsmen may not venture to wreak their lawless vengeance upon him." Roque, filled with admiration at the gallant bearing, high spirit, comely figure, and adventure of the fair Claudia, said to her, "Come, Signora, let us go and see if thy enemy is dead, and then we will consider what will be best for thee." Don Quixote, who had been listening to what Claudia said, and Roque Guinart said in reply to her, exclaimed, "Nobody need trouble himself with the defence of this lady, for I take it upon myself. Give me my horse and arms, and wait for me here. I will go in quest of this knight, and dead or alive I will make him keep his word plighted to so great a beauty." "Nobody need have any doubt about that," said Sancho, "for my master has a very happy knack of matchmaking. It's not many days since he forced another man to marry, who in the same way backed out of his promise to another maiden,
and if it had not been for his persecutors the enchanters changing the man's proper shape into a lackey's, the said maiden would not be won this minute." Roque, who was paying more attention to the fair Claudia's adventure than to the words of master or man, did not hear them, and ordering his squires to restore to Sancho everything they had stripped Dapple of, he directed them to return to the place where they had been quartered during the night, and then set off with Claudia at full speed in search of the wounded or slain Don Vicente. They reached the spot where Claudia had met them, but found nothing there save freshly spilt blood. Looking all around, however, they descried some people on the slope of a hill above them, and concluded, as indeed it proved to be, that it was Don Vicente, whom, either dead or alive, his servants were removing to attend his wounds or to bury him. They made haste to overtake them, which, as the party moved slowly, they were able to do with ease. They found Don Vicente in the arms of his servants, whom he was entreating in a broken, feeble voice to leave him there to die, as the pain of his wounds would not suffer him to go any farther. Claudia and Roque threw themselves off their horses and advanced towards him. The servants were overawed by the appearance of Roque, and Claudia was moved by the sight of Don Vicente, and going up to him half tenderly, half sternly, she seized his hand and said to him, "Hadst thou given me this according to our compact, thou hadst never come to this pass." The wounded gentleman opened his all but closed eyes, and recognizing Claudia, said, "I see clearly, fair and mistaken lady, that it is thou that hast slain me, a punishment not merited or deserved by my feelings toward thee, for never did I mean to, nor could I, wrong thee in thought or deed." "It is not true, then," said Claudia, "that thou were going this morning to marry Leonora, the daughter of the rich Balvestro?" "Assuredly not," replied Don Vicente. "My cruel misfortune must have carried those tidings to thee, to drive thee in thy jealousy to take my life. And to assure thyself of this, press my hands, and take me for thy husband if thou wilt. I have no better satisfaction to offer thee for the wrong thou fanciest thou hast received from me." Claudia wrung his hands, and her own heart was so wrung that she lay fainting on the bleeding breast of Don Vicente, whom a death spasm seized at the same instant. Roque was in perplexity, and knew not what to do. The servants ran to fetch water to sprinkle their faces, and brought some and bathed them with it. Claudia recovered from her fainting fit, but not so Don Vicente from the paroxysm that overtaken him, for his life had come to an end. On perceiving this, Claudia, when she had convinced herself that her beloved husband was no more, rent the air with her sighs, and made the heavens ring with her lamentations. She tore her hair and scattered it to the winds. She beat her face with her hands, and showed all the signs of grief and sorrow that could be conceived to come from an afflicted heart. "Cruel, reckless woman!" she cried. "How easily wert thou moved to carry out a thought so wicked! O furious force of jealousy, to what desperate lengths dost thou lead those that give thee lodging in their bosoms! O husband, whose unhappy fate in being mine hath borne thee from the marriage bed to the grave!" So vehement and so piteous were the lamentations of Claudia that they drew tears from Roque's eyes, unused as they were to shed them on any occasion. The servants wept. Claudia swooned away again and again, and the whole place seemed a field of sorrow and an abode of misfortune. In the end, Roque Guinart directed Don Vicente's servants to carry his body to his father's village, which was close by, for burial. Claudia told him she meant to go to a monastery of which an aunt of hers was abbess, where she intended to pass her life with a better and everlasting spouse. He applauded her pious resolution, and offered to accompany her whithersoever she wished, and to protect her father against the kinsmen of Don Vicente and all the world, should they seek to injure him. Claudia would not on any account allow him to accompany her, and thanking him for his offers as well as she could, took leave of him in tears. The servants of Don Vicente carried away his body, and Roque returned to his comrades, and so ended the love of Claudia Hieronima. But what wonder, when it was the insuperable and cruel might of jealousy that wove the web of her sad story. Roque Guinart found his squires at the place to which he had ordered them, and Don Quixote on Rocinante in the midst of them, delivering a harangue to them in which he urged them to give up a mode of life so full of peril, as well to the soul as to the body. But as most of them were Gascons, rough, lawless fellows, his speech did not make much impression on them. Roque, on coming up, asked Sancho if his men had returned and restored to him the treasures and jewels they had stripped off Dapple. Sancho said they had, but that 3 kerchiefs that were worth 3 cities were missing. "What are you talking about, man?" said one of the bystanders. "I have got them, and they are not worth 3 reals." "That is true," said Don Quixote, "but my squire values them at the rate he says, as having been given me by the person who gave them." Roque Guinart ordered them to be restored at once, and making his men fall in line, he directed all the clothing, jewelry, and money that they had taken since the last distribution to be produced, and making a hasty valuation, and reducing what could not be divided into money, he made shares for the whole band so equitably and carefully that in no case did he exceed or fall short of strict distributive justice. When this had been done, and all left satisfied, Roque observed to Don Quixote, "If this scrupulous exactness were not observed with these fellows, there would be no living with them." Upon this Sancho remarked, "From what I have seen here, justice is such a good thing that there is no doing without it, even among the thieves themselves." One of the squires heard this, and raising the butt end of his harquebus, would no doubt have broken Sancho's head with it, had not Roque Guinart called out to him to hold his hand. Sancho was frightened out of his wits, and vowed not to open his lips so long as he was in the company of these people. At this instant 1 or 2 of those squires who were posted as sentinels on the roads, to watch who came along them and report what passed to their chief, came up and said, "Señor, there is a great troop of people not far off coming along the road to Barcelona." To which Roque replied, "Hast thou made out whether they are of the sort that are after us, or of the sort we are after?" "The sort we are after," said the squire. "Well then, away with you all," said Roque, "and bring them here to me at once without letting one of them escape." They obeyed, and Don Quixote, Sancho, and Roque, left by themselves, waited to see what the squires brought. And while they were waiting, Roque said to Don Quixote, "It must seem strange sort of life to Señor Don Quixote, this of ours, strange adventures, strange incidents, and all full of danger, and I do not wonder that it should seem so, for in truth I must own there is no mode of life more restless or anxious than ours. What led me into it was a certain thirst for vengeance, which is strong enough to disturb the quietest hearts. I am, by nature, tender-hearted and kindly, but, as I said, the desire to revenge myself for a wrong that was done me so overturns all my better impulses that I keep on in this way of life in spite of what conscience tells me. And as one depth calls to another, and one sin to another sin, revenges have linked themselves together, and I have taken upon myself not only my own, but those of others. It pleases God, however, that though I see myself in this maze of entanglements, I do not lose all hope of escaping from it and reaching a safe port." Don Quixote was amazed to hear Roque utter such excellent and just sentiments, for he did not think that among those who followed such trades as robbing, murdering, and waylaying, there could be anyone capable of a virtuous thought. And he said in reply, "Signor Roque, the beginning of health lies in knowing the disease, and in the sick man's willingness to take the medicines which the physician prescribes. You are sick. You know what ails you, and heaven, or more properly speaking, God, who is our physician, will administer medicines that will cure you, and cure gradually, and not of a sudden or by a miracle. Besides, sinners of discernment are nearer amendment than those who are fools, and as your worship has shown good sense in your remarks, all you have to do is to keep up a good heart and trust that the weakness of your conscience will be strengthened. And if you have any desire to shorten the journey and put yourself easily in the way of salvation, come with me, and I will show you how to become a knight-errant, a calling wherein so many hardships and mishaps are encountered that if they be taken as penances, they will lodge you in heaven in a trice." Roque laughed at Don Quixote's exhortation, and, changing the conversation, he related the tragic affair of Claudia Hieronima, at which Sancho was extremely grieved, for he had not found the young woman's beauty, boldness, and spirit at all amiss. And now the squires dispatched to make the prize came up, bringing with them 2 gentlemen on horseback, 2 pilgrims on foot, and a coach full of women with some 6 servants on foot and on horseback in attendance on them, and a couple of muleteers whom the gentlemen had with them. The squires made a ring around them, both victors and vanquished maintaining profound silence, waiting for the great Roque Guinart to speak. He asked the gentlemen who they were, whither they were going, and what money they carried with them. "Signor," replied one of them, "we are 2 captains of Spanish infantry. Our companies are at Naples, and we are on our way to embark in 4 galleys, which they say are at Barcelona, under orders for Sicily. And we have about 200 or 300 crowns, with which we are, according to our notions, rich and contented, for a soldier's poverty does not allow a more extensive hoard." Roque asked the pilgrims the same question he had put to the captains, and was answered that they were going to take ship for Rome, and that between them they might have about 60 reals. He asked also who was in the coach, whither they were bound, and what money they had, and one of the men on horseback replied, "The persons in the coach are my lady Donna Guiomar de Conez, wife of the regent of Vacaria at Naples, her little daughter, a handmaid, and a duenna. We 6 servants are in attendance upon her, and the money amounts to 600 crowns. "So then," said Roque Guinart, "we have got here 900 crowns and 60 reals. My soldiers must number some 60. See how much there falls to each, for I am a bad arithmetician." As soon as the robbers heard this, they raised a shout of "Long life to Roque Guinart, in spite of the ladres that seek his ruin." The captains showed plainly the concern they felt. The regent's lady was downcast, and the pilgrims did not at all enjoy seeing their property confiscated. Roque kept them in suspense in this way for a while, but he had no desire to prolong their distress, which might be seen in a bow shot off, and turning to the captains he said, "Sirs, will your worships be pleased of your courtesy to lend me 60 crowns, and her ladyship the regent's wife 80, to satisfy this band that follows me, for it is by his singing the abbot gets his dinner, and then you may at once proceed on your journey, free and unhindered, with safe conduct which I shall give you, so that if you come across any other bands of mine that I have scattered in these parts, they may do you no harm, for I have no intention of doing injury to soldiers or to any woman, especially one of quality." Profuse and hearty were the expressions of gratitude with which the captains thanked Roque for his courtesy and generosity. For such they regarded his leaving them their own money. Signora Donna Guiomar de Conez wanted to throw herself out of the coach to kiss the feet and hands of the great Roque, but he would not suffer it on any account. So far from that, he begged her pardon for the wrong he had done her under pressure of the inexorable necessities of his unfortunate calling. The regent's lady ordered one of her servants to give the 80 crowns that had been assessed as her share at once, for the captains had already paid down their 60. The pilgrims were about to give up the whole of their little hoard, but Roque bade them keep quiet, and turning to his men, he said, "Of these crowns 2 fall to each man, and 20 remain over. Let 10 be given to these pilgrims, and the other 10 to this worthy squire, that he may be able to speak favorably of this adventure." And then, having writing materials, with which he always went provided, brought to him, he gave them in writing a safe conduct to the leaders of his bands, and bidding them farewell, let them go free, and filled with admiration at his magnanimity, his generous disposition, and his unusual conduct, and inclined to regard him as an Alexander the Great rather than a notorious robber. One of the squires observed in his mixture of Gascon and Catalan, "This captain of ours would make a better friar than highwayman. If he wants to be so generous another time, let it be with his own property and not ours." The unlucky wight did not speak so low but that Roque overheard him, and drawing his sword almost split his head in two, saying, "That is the way I punish impudent, saucy fellows." They were all taken aback, and not one of them dared to utter a word, such deference did they pay him. Roque then withdrew to one side and wrote a letter to a friend of his at Barcelona, telling him that the famous Don Quixote of La Mancha, the knight-errant of whom there was so much talk, was with him, and was, he assured him, the drollest and wisest man in the world, and that in 4 from that date, that is to say, on St. John the Baptist's day, he was going to deposit him in full armor, mounted on his horse Rocinante, together with his squire Sancho on an ass, in the middle of the strand of the city, and bidding him give notice of this to his friends the narrates, that they might divert themselves with him. He wished, he said, his enemies, the cadets, could be deprived of this pleasure, but that was impossible, because the crazies and shrewd sayings of Don Quixote and the humors of his squire Sancho Panza could not help giving general pleasure to all the world. He dispatched the letter by one of his squires, who, exchanging the costume of a highwayman for that of a peasant, made his way into Barcelona and gave it to the person to whom it was directed. End of Chapter 60.
Chapters 61 and 62 of Don Quixote, Volume 2. Chapter 61. Of what happened Don Quixote on entering Barcelona, together with other matters that partake of the true rather than of the ingenious. Don Quixote passed 3 days and 3 nights with Roque, and had he passed 300 years, he would have found enough to observe and wonder at in his mode of life. At daybreak they were in one spot, at dinner-time in another. Sometimes they fled without knowing from whom, at other times they lay in wait, not knowing for what. They slept standing, breaking their slumbers to shift from place to place. There was nothing but sending out spies and scouts, posting sentinels and blowing the matches of arquebuses, though they carried but few, for almost all used flintlocks. Roque passed his nights in some place or other apart from his men, that they might not know where he was, for the many proclamations the Viceroy of Barcelona had issued against his life kept him in fear and uneasiness, and he did not venture to trust anyone, afraid that even his own men would kill him or deliver him up to the authorities. Of a truth, a weary, miserable life. At length, by unfrequented roads, short cuts and secret paths, Roque, Don Quixote, and Sancho, together with 6 squires, set out for Barcelona. They reached the strand on St. John's Eve during the night, and Roque, after embracing Don Quixote and Sancho, to whom he presented the 10 crowns he had promised but had not till then given, left them with many expressions of goodwill on both sides. Roque went back, while Don Quixote remained on horseback, just as he was, waiting for day, and it was not long before the countenance of the fair Aurora began to show itself at the balconies of the east, gladdening the grass and flowers, if not the ear, though to gladden that too there came at the same moment a sound of clarions and drums, and a din of bells, and a tramp, tramp, and cries of "Clear the way there!" of some runners, that seemed to issue from the city. The dawn made way for the sun that with a face broader than a buckler began to rise slowly above the low line of the horizon. Don Quixote and Sancho gazed all around them. They beheld the sea, a sight till then unseen by them. It struck them as exceedingly spacious and broad, much more so than the lakes of Ruidera, which they had seen in La Mancha. They saw the galleys along the beach, which, lowering their awnings, displayed themselves decked with streamers and pennons that trembled in the breeze and kissed and swept the water, while on board the bugles, trumpets, and clarions were sounding and filling the air far and near with melodious warlike notes. Then they began to move and execute a kind of skirmish upon the calm water, while a vast number of horsemen on fine horses and in showy liveries, issuing from the city, engaged on their side in a somewhat similar movement. The soldiers on board the galleys kept up a ceaseless fire, which they on the walls and forts of the city returned, and the heavy cannon rent the air with a tremendous noise they made, to which the gangway guns of the galleys replied. The bright sea, the smiling earth, the clear air, though at times darkened by the smoke of the guns, all seemed to fill the whole multitude with unexpected delight. Sancho could not make out how it was that these great masses that moved over the sea had so many feet. And now the horsemen in livery came galloping up with shouts and outlandish cries and cheers to where Don Quixote stood amazed and wondering, and one of them, he to whom Roque had sent word, addressing him, exclaimed, "Welcome to our city, mirror, beacon, star, and cynosure of all knight-errantry in its widest extent. Welcome, I say, valiant Don Quixote of La Mancha, not the false, the fictitious, the apocryphal, that these latter days have offered us in lying histories, but the true, the legitimate, the real one that Cide Hamete Benengeli, flower of historians, has described to us." Don Quixote made no answer, nor did the horsemen wait for one, but wheeling again with all their followers, they began curvetting around Don Quixote, who, turning to Sancho, said, "These gentlemen have plainly recognized us. I will wager they have read our history, and even that newly printed one by the Aragonese." The cavalier who had addressed Don Quixote again approached him and said, "Come with us, Señor Don Quixote, for we are all of us your servants and great friends of Roque Guinart's." To which Don Quixote returned, "If courtesy breeds courtesy, yours, Sir Knight, is daughter or very nearly akin to the great Roque's. Carry me where you please. I will have no will but yours, especially if you deign to employ it in your service." The cavalier replied with words no less polite, and then, all closing in around him, they set out with him for the city, to the music of the clarions and the drums. As they were entering it, the wicked one, who is the author of all mischief, and the boys who are wickeder than the wicked one, contrived that a couple of these audacious irrepressible urchins should force their way through the crowd, and lifting up, one of them Dapple's tail and the other Rocinante's, insert a bunch of furs under each. The poor beasts felt the strange spurs and added to their anguish by pressing their tails tight, so much so that, cutting a multitude of capers, they flung their masters to the ground. Don Quixote, covered with shame and out of countenance, ran to pluck the plume from the poor jade's tail, while Sancho did the same for Dapple. His conductors tried to punish the audacity of the boys, but there was no possibility of doing so, for they hid themselves among the hundreds of others that were following them. Don Quixote and Sancho mounted once more, and with the same music and acclamations reached their conductor's house, which was large and stately, that of a rich gentleman in short. And there for the present we will leave them, for such is Cide Hamete's pleasure. Chapter 62, which deals with the adventure of the enchanted head, together with other trivial matters which cannot be left untold. Don Quixote's host was one Don Antonio Moreno by name, a gentleman of wealth and intelligence, and very fond of diverting himself in any fair and good-natured way, and having Don Quixote in his house, he set about devising modes of making him exhibit his mad points in some harmless fashion, for jests that give pain are no jests, and no sport is worth anything if it hurts another. The first thing he did was to make Don Quixote take off his armour, and lead him in that tight chamois suit we have already described and depicted more than once, out on a balcony overhanging one of the chief streets of the city, in full view of the crowd and of the boys, who gazed at him as they would at a monkey. The cavaliers in livery careered before him again as though it were for him alone, and not to enliven the festival of the day, that they wore it, and Sancho was in high delight, for it seemed to him that, how he knew not, he had fallen upon another Camacho's wedding, another house like Don Diego de Miranda's, another castle like the duke's. Some of Don Antonio's friends dined with him that day, and all showed honour to Don Quixote and treated him as a knight-errant, and he, becoming puffed up and exalted in consequence, could not contain himself for satisfaction. Such were the drolleries of Sancho that all the servants of the house, and all who heard him, were kept hanging upon his lips. While at table Don Antonio said to him, "We hear, worthy Sancho, that you are so fond of manjar blanco and forced meat balls, that if you have any left, you keep them in your bosom for the next day." "No, señor, that's not true," said Sancho, "for I am more cleanly than greedy, and my master Don Quixote here knows well that we two are used to live for a week on a handful of acorns or nuts. To be sure, if it so happens that they offer me a heifer, I run with a halter. I mean, I eat what I'm given, and make use of opportunities as I find them. But whoever says that I'm an out-of-the-way eater, or not cleanly, let me tell him that he is wrong, and I'd put it in a different way if I did not respect the honourable beards that are at the table." "Indeed," said Don Quixote, "Sancho's moderation and cleanliness in eating might be inscribed and graved on plates of brass to be kept in eternal remembrance in ages to come. It is true that when he is hungry there is a certain appearance of voracity about him, for he eats at a great pace and chews with both jaws, but cleanliness he is always mindful of, and when he was governor he learned how to eat daintily, so much so that he eats grapes and even pomegranate pips with a fork." "What!" said Don Antonio, "has Sancho been a governor?" "Ay," said Sancho, "and of an island called Barataria. I governed it to perfection for 10 days, and lost my rest all the time, and learned to look down upon all the governments in the world. I got out of it by taking to flight, and fell into a pit where I gave myself up for dead, and out of which I escaped alive by a miracle." Don Quixote then gave them a minute account of the whole affair of Sancho's government, with which he greatly amused his hearers. On the cloth being removed, Don Antonio, taking Don Quixote by the hand, passed with him into a distant room in which there was nothing in the way of furniture except a table, apparently of jasper, resting on a pedestal of the same, upon which was set up, after the fashion of the busts of the Roman emperors, a head which seemed to be of bronze. Don Antonio traversed the whole apartment with Don Quixote, and walked around the table several times, and then said, "Now, Señor Don Quixote, that I am satisfied that no one is listening to us and that the door is shut, I will tell you one of the rarest adventures, or more properly speaking strange things, that can be imagined, on condition that you will keep what I say to you in the remotest recesses of secrecy." "I swear it," said Don Quixote, "and for greater security I will put a flagstone over it, for I would have you know, Señor Don Antonio," he had by this time learned his name, "that you are addressing one who, though he has ears to hear, has no tongue to speak, so that you may safely transfer whatever you have in your bosom into mine, and rely upon it that you have consigned it to the depths of silence." "In reliance upon that promise," said Don Antonio, "I will astonish you with what you shall see and hear, and relieve myself of some of the vexation it gives me to have no one to whom I can confide my secrets, for they are not of a sort to be entrusted to everybody." Don Quixote was puzzled, wondering what could be the object of such precautions, whereupon Don Antonio, taking his hand, passed it over the bronze head and the whole table and pedestal of jasper on which it stood, and then said, "This head, Señor Don Quixote, has been made and fabricated by one of the greatest magicians and wizards the world ever saw, a Pole, I believe, by birth, and a pupil of the famous Escotillo, of whom such marvellous stories are told. He was here in my house, and for a consideration of 1,000 crowns that I gave him he constructed this head, which has the property and virtue of answering whatever questions are put to its ear. He observed the points of the compass, he traced figures, he studied the stars, he watched favourable moments, and at length brought it to the perfection we shall see tomorrow, for on Fridays it is mute, and this being Friday we must wait till the next day. In the interval your worship may consider what you would like to ask it, and I know by experience that in all its answers it tells the truth." Don Quixote was amazed at the virtue and property of the head, and was inclined to disbelieve Don Antonio; but seeing what a short time he had to wait to test the matter, he did not choose to say anything except that he thanked him for having revealed to him so mighty a secret. They then quitted the room, Don Antonio locked the door, and they repaired to the chamber where the rest of the gentlemen were assembled. In the meantime Sancho had recounted to them several of the adventures and accidents that had happened his master. That afternoon they took Don Quixote out for a stroll, not in his armour but in street costume, with a surcoat of tawny cloth upon him that at that season would have made ice itself sweat. Orders were left with the servants to entertain Sancho so as not to let him leave the house. Don Quixote was mounted, not on Rocinante, but upon a tall mule of easy pace and handsomely caparisoned. They put the surcoat on him, and on the back, without his perceiving it, they stitched a parchment on which they wrote in large letters, "This is Don Quixote of La Mancha." As they set out upon their excursion, the placard attracted the eyes of all who chanced to see him, and as they read out, "This is Don Quixote of La Mancha," Don Quixote was amazed to see how many people gazed at him, called him by his name, and recognized him, and turning to Don Antonio, who rode at his side, he observed to him, "Great are the privileges knight-errantry involves, for it makes him who professes it known and famous in every region of the earth. See, Don Antonio, even the very boys of this city know me without ever having seen me." "True, Señor Don Quixote," returned Don Antonio, "for as fire cannot be hidden or kept secret, virtue cannot escape being recognized; and that which is attained by the profession of arms shines distinguished above all others." It came to pass, however, that as Don Quixote was proceeding amid the acclamations that have been described, a Castilian, reading the inscription on his back, cried out in a loud voice, "The devil take thee for a Don Quixote of La Mancha! What! Art thou here, and not dead of the countless drubbings that have fallen on thy ribs? Thou art mad, and if thou wert so by thyself, and kept thyself within thy madness, it would not be so bad; but thou hast the gift of making fools and blockheads of all who have anything to do with thee or say to thee. Why, look at these gentlemen bearing thee company! Get thee home, blockhead, and see after thy affairs, and thy wife and children, and give over these fooleries that are sapping thy brains and skimming away thy wits." "Go your own way, brother," said Don Antonio, "and don't offer advice to those who don't ask you for it. Señor Don Quixote is in his full senses, and we who bear him company are not fools. Virtue is to be honoured wherever it may be found. Go, and bad luck to you, and don't meddle where you are not wanted." "By God, your worship is right," replied the Castilian, "for to advise this good man is to kick against the pricks; still for all that it fills me with pity that the sound wit they say the blockhead has in everything should dribble away by the channel of his knight-errantry; but may the bad luck your worship talks of follow me and all my descendants, if, from this day forth, though I should live longer than Methuselah, I ever give advice to anybody even if he asks me for it." The advice giver took himself off, and they continued their stroll, but so great was the press of the boys and people to read the placard, that Don Antonio was forced to remove it as if he were taking off something else. Night came, and they went home, and there was a ladies' dancing party, for Don Antonio's wife, a lady of rank and gaiety, beauty and wit, had invited some friends of hers to come and do honour to her guest and amuse themselves with his strange delusions. Several of them came, they supped sumptuously, the dance began at about 10 o'clock. Among the ladies were two of a mischievous and frolicsome turn, and though perfectly modest, somewhat free in playing tricks for harmless diversion's sake. These two were so indefatigable in taking Don Quixote out to dance that they tired him down, not only in body but in spirit. It was a sight to see the figure Don Quixote made, long, lank, lean, and yellow, his garments clinging tight to him, ungainly, and above all anything but agile. The gay ladies made secret love to him, and he on his part secretly repelled them, but finding himself hard pressed by their blandishments, he lifted up his voice and exclaimed, "Fugite, partes adversae! Leave me in peace, unwelcome overtures. Avaunt with your desires, ladies, for she who is queen of mine, the peerless Dulcinea del Toboso, suffers none but hers to lead me captive and subdue me." And so saying, he sat down on the floor in the middle of the room, tired out and broken down by all this exertion in the dance. Don Antonio directed him to be taken up bodily and carried to bed, and the first that laid hold of him was Sancho, saying as he did so, In an evil hour you took to dancing, master mine. Do you fancy all mighty men of valour are dancers, and all knights-errant given to capering? If you do, I can tell you you are mistaken. There's many a man would rather undertake to kill a giant than cut a caper. If it had been the shoe-fling you were at, I could take your place, for I can do the shoe-fling like a gerfalcon, but I'm no good at dancing." With these and other observations, Sancho set the whole ballroom laughing, and then put his master to bed, covering him up well so that he might sweat out any chill caught after his dancing. The next day Don Antonio thought he might as well make trial of the enchanted head, and with Don Quixote, Sancho, and 2 others, friends of his, besides the 2 ladies that had tired out Don Quixote at the ball, who had remained for the night with Don Antonio's wife, he locked himself up in the chamber where the head was. He explained to them the property it possessed, and entrusted the secret to them, telling them that now, for the first time, he was going to try the virtue of the enchanted head. But except Don Antonio's 2 friends, no one else was privy to the mystery of the enchantment, and if Don Antonio had not first revealed it to them, they would have been inevitably reduced to the same state of amazement as the rest, so artfully and skilfully was it contrived. The first to approach the ear of the head was Don Antonio himself, and in a low voice, but not so low as not to be audible to all, he said to it, "Head, tell me by the virtue that lies in thee, what am I at this moment thinking of?" The head, without any movement of the lips, answered in a clear and distinct voice, so as to be heard by all, "I cannot judge of thoughts." All were thunderstruck at this, and all the more so as they saw that there was nobody anywhere near the table or in the whole room that could have answered. "How many of us are here?" asked Don Antonio once more, and it was answered him in the same way softly, "Thou and thy wife, with 2 friends of thine and 2 of hers, and a famous knight called Don Quixote of La Mancha, and a squire of his, Sancho Panza by name." Now there was fresh astonishment, now everyone's hair was standing on end with awe, and Don Antonio retiring from the head exclaimed, "This suffices to show me that I have not been deceived by him who sold thee to me, O sage head, talking head, answering head, wonderful head. Let someone else go and put what question he likes to it." And as women are commonly impulsive and inquisitive, the first to come forward was one of the 2 friends of Don Antonio's wife, and her question was, "Tell me, head, what shall I do to be very beautiful?" And the answer she got was, "Be very modest." "I question thee no further," said the fair querist. Her companion then came up and said, "I should like to know, head, whether my husband loves me or not." The answer given to her was, "Think how he uses thee, and thou mayest guess." And the married lady went off saying, "That answer did not need a question, for of course the treatment one receives shows the disposition of him from whom it is received." Then one of Don Antonio's 2 friends advanced and asked it, "Who am I?" "Thou knowest," was the answer. "That is not what I ask thee," said the gentleman, "but to tell me if thou knowest me." "Yes, I know thee, thou art Don Pedro Noriz," was the reply. "I do not seek to know more," said the gentleman, "for this is enough to convince me, O head, that thou knowest everything." And as he retired the other friend came forward and asked it, "Tell me, head, what are the wishes of my eldest son?" "I have said already," was the answer, "that I cannot judge of wishes. However, I can tell thee the wish of thy son is to bury thee." "That's what I see with my eyes I point out with my finger," said the gentleman, "so I ask no more." Don Antonio's wife came up and said, "I know not what to ask thee, head. I would only seek to know of thee if I shall have many years of enjoyment of my good husband." And the answer she received was, "Thou shalt, for his vigour and his temperate habits promise many years of life, which by their intemperance others so often cut short." Then Don Quixote came forward and asked, "Tell me, thou that answerest, was that which I describe as having happened to me in the cave of Montesinos the truth or a dream? Will Sancho's whipping be accomplished without fail? Will the disenchantment of Dulcinea be brought about?" "As to the question of the cave," was the reply, "there is much to be said, there is something of both in it. Sancho's whipping will proceed leisurely. The disenchantment of Dulcinea will attain its due consummation." "I seek to know no more," said Don Quixote. "Let me but see Dulcinea disenchanted, and I will consider that all the good fortune I could wish for has come upon me all at once." The last questioner was Sancho, and his questions were: Head, shall I by any chance have another government? Shall I ever escape from the hard life of a squire? Shall I get back to see my wife and children? To which the answer came: Thou shalt govern in thy house, and if thou returnest to it thou shalt see thy wife and children, and on ceasing to serve thou shalt cease to be a squire. Good, by God, said Sancho Panza, I could have told myself that. The prophet Perogullo could have said no more. What answer wouldst thou have, beast? Said Don Quixote. Is it not enough that the replies this head has given suit the questions put to it? Yes, it is enough, said Sancho, but I should have liked it to have made itself plainer and told me more. The questions and answers came to an end here, but not the wonder with which all were filled, except Don Antonio's two friends, who were in the secret. This Cide Hamete Benengeli thought fit to reveal at once, not to keep the world in suspense, fancying that the head had some strange magical mystery in it. He says, therefore, that on the model of another head, the work of an image-maker, which he had seen at Madrid, Don Antonio made this one at home for his own amusement and to astonish ignorant people, and its mechanism was as follows. The table was of wood, painted and varnished to imitate jasper, and the pedestal on which it stood was of the same material, with 4 eagles' claws projecting from it to support the weight more steadily. The head, which resembled a bust or figure of a Roman emperor, and was coloured like bronze, was hollow throughout, as was the table, into which it was fitted so exactly that no trace of the joining was visible. The pedestal of the table was also hollow, and communicated with the throat and neck of the head, and the whole was in communication with another room underneath the chamber in which the head stood. Through the entire cavity in the pedestal, table, throat, and neck of the bust or figure, there passed a tube of tin carefully adjusted and concealed from sight. In the room below, corresponding to the one above, was placed the person who was to answer, with his mouth to the tube, and the voice, as in an ear-trumpet, passed from above downwards, and from below upwards, the words coming clearly and distinctly. It was impossible thus to detect the trick. A nephew of Don Antonio's, a smart, sharp-witted student, was the answerer, and as he had been told beforehand by his uncle who the persons were that would come with him that day into the chamber where the head was, it was an easy matter for him to answer the first question at once and correctly. The others he answered by guesswork, and, being clever, cleverly. Cide Hamete adds that this marvellous contrivance stood for some 10 or 12 days, but that, as it became noised abroad through the city that he had in his house an enchanted head that answered all who asked questions of it, Don Antonio, fearing it might come to the ears of the watchful sentinels of our faith, explained the matter to the inquisitors, who commanded him to break it up and have done with it, lest the ignorant vulgar should be scandalized. By Don Quixote, however, and by Sancho, the head was still held to be an enchanted one, and capable of answering questions, though more to Don Quixote's satisfaction than Sancho's. The gentlemen of the city, to gratify Don Antonio, and also to do the honours to Don Quixote and give him an opportunity of displaying his folly, made arrangements for a tilting at the ring in 6 days from that time, which, however, for reason that will be mentioned hereafter, did not take place. Don Quixote took a fancy to stroll about the city quietly and on foot, for he feared that if he went on horseback the boys would follow him, so he and Sancho and 2 servants that Don Antonio gave him set out for a walk. Thus it came to pass that going along one of the streets, Don Quixote lifted up his eyes and saw written in very large letters over a door, "Books printed here," at which he was vastly pleased, for until then he had never seen a printing office, and he was curious to know what it was like. He entered with all his following, and saw them drawing sheets in one place, correcting in another, setting up type here, revising there, in short, all the work that is to be seen in great printing offices. He went up to one case and asked what they were about there. The workmen told him. He watched them with wonder and passed on. He approached one man among others and asked him what he was doing. The workmen replied, "Señor, this gentleman here," pointing to a man of prepossessing appearance and a certain gravity of look, "has translated an Italian book into our Spanish tongue, and I am setting it up in type for the press." "What is the title of the book?" asked Don Quixote, to which the author replied, "Señor, in Italian the book is called Le Bagatelle." "And what does Le Bagatelle import in our Spanish?" asked Don Quixote. "Le Bagatelle," said the author, "is as though we should say in Spanish Los Juguetes. but though the book is humble in name, it has good solid matter in it. I, said Don Quixote, have some little smattering of Italian, and I plume myself on singing some of Ariosto's stanzas. But tell me, señor, I do not say this to test your ability, but merely out of curiosity, have you ever met with the word pignata in your book? Yes, often, said the author. And how do you render that in Spanish? How should I render it, returned the author, but by olla? Varia me, exclaimed Don Quixote, what a proficient you are in the Italian language! I would lay a good wager that where they say in Italian piazze, you say in Spanish place, and where they say più, you say mas, and you translate su by arriba, and giu by abajo. I translate them so, of course, said the author, for those are their proper equivalents. I would venture to swear, said Don Quixote, that your worship is not known in the world, which always begrudges their reward to rare wits and praiseworthy labours. What talents lie wasted there! What genius thrust away into corners! What worth left neglected! Still it seems to me that translation from one language to another, if it be not from the queens of languages, the Greek and the Latin, is like looking at Flemish tapestries on the wrong side, for though the figures are visible, they are full of threads that make them indistinct, and they do not show with the smoothness and brightness of the right side. And translation from easy languages argues neither ingenuity nor command of words, any more than transcribing or copying out one document from another. But I do not mean by this to draw the inference that no credit is to be allowed for the work of translating, for a man may employ himself in ways worse and less profitable to himself. This estimate does not include two famous translators, Dr. Cristobal de Figueroa, in his Pastor Fido, and Don Juan de Juaregui, in his Aminta, wherein by their felicity they leave it in doubt which is the translation and which the original. But tell me, are you printing this book at your own risk, or have you sold the copyright to some bookseller? I print at my own risk, said the author, and I expect to make 1,000 ducats at least by this first edition, which is to be of 2,000 copies that will go off in a twinkling at 6 reals apiece. A fine calculation you are making, said Don Quixote. It is plain you don't know the ins and outs of the printers, and how they play into one another's hands. I promise you when you find yourself saddled with 2,000 copies, you will feel so sore that it will astonish you, particularly if the book is little out of the common, and not in any way highly spiced. What, said the author, would your worship then have me give it to a bookseller who will give me 3 maravedis for the copyright, and think he is doing me a favour? I do not print my books to win fame in the world, for I am known in it already by my works. I want to make money, without which reputation is not worth a rap. God send your worship good luck, said Don Quixote, and he moved on to another case, where he saw them correcting a sheet of a book with the title of Light of the Soul. Noticing it, he observed, books like this, though there are many of the kind, are the ones that deserve to be printed, for many are the sinners in these days, and lights unnumbered are needed for all that are in darkness. He passed on, and saw that they were also correcting another book, and when he asked its title, they told him it was called The Second Part of the Ingenious Gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha, by one of Tordesillas. I have heard of this book already, said Don Quixote, and verily and on my conscience I thought it had been by this time burned to ashes as a meddlesome intruder. But its Martinmas will come to it as it does to every pig, for fictions have the more merit and charm about them, the more nearly they approach the truth or what looks like it, and true stories, the truer they are, the better they are. And so saying, he walked out of the printing office with a certain amount of displeasure in his looks. That same day Don Antonio arranged to take him to see the galleys that lay at the beach, whereat Sancho was in high delight, as he had never seen any all his life. Don Antonio sent word to the commandant of the galleys that he intended to bring his guest, the famous Don Quixote of La Mancha, of whom the commandant and all the citizens had already heard, that afternoon to see them, and what happened on board of them will be told in the next chapter. End of chapter 62. Chapters 63 and 64 of Don Quixote, Volume 2. Chapter 63. Of the mishap that befell Sancho Panza through the visit to the galleys, and the strange adventure of the fair Morisco. Profound were Don Quixote's reflections on the reply of the enchanted head, not one of them, however, hitting on the secret of the trick, but all concentrated on the promise, which he regarded as a certainty, of Dulcinea's disenchantment. This he turned over in his mind again and again with great satisfaction, fully persuaded that he would shortly see its fulfilment; and as for Sancho, though, as has been said, he hated being a governor, still he had a longing to be giving orders, and finding himself obeyed once more. This is the misfortune that being in authority, even in jest, brings with it. To resume, that afternoon their host Don Antonio Moreno and his two friends, with Don Quixote and Sancho, went to the galleys. The commandant had been already made aware of his good fortune in seeing two such famous persons as Don Quixote and Sancho, and the instant they came to the shore all the galleys struck their awnings and the clarions rang out. A skiff covered with rich carpets and cushions of crimson velvet was immediately lowered into the water, and as Don Quixote stepped on board of it, the leading galley fired her gangway gun, and the other galleys did the same, and as he mounted the starboard ladder, the whole crew saluted him, as is the custom when a personage of distinction comes on board a galley, by exclaiming "Hoo, hoo, hoo" 3 times. The general, for so we shall call him, a Valencian gentleman of rank, gave him his hand and embraced him, saying, "I shall mark this day with a white stone as one of the happiest I can expect to enjoy in my lifetime, since I have seen Señor Don Quixote of La Mancha, pattern and image wherein we see contained and condensed all that is worthy in knight-errantry." Don Quixote, delighted beyond measure with such a lordly reception, replied to him in words no less courteous. All then proceeded to the poop, which was very handsomely decorated, and seated themselves on the bulwark benches. The boatswain passed along the gangway and piped all hands to strip, which they did in an instant. Sancho, seeing such a number of men stripped to the skin, was taken aback, and still more when he saw them spread the awnings so briskly that it seemed to him as if all the devils were at work at it. But all this was cakes and fancy bread to what I am going to tell now. Sancho was seated on the captain's stage, close to the aftermost rower on the right-hand side. He, previously instructed in what he was to do, laid hold of Sancho, hoisting him up in his arms, and the whole crew, who were standing ready, beginning on the right, proceeded to pass him on, whirling him along from hand to hand and from bench to bench, with such rapidity that it took the sight out of poor Sancho's eyes, and he made quite sure that the devils themselves were flying away with him. Nor did they leave off with him until they had sent him back along the left side and deposited him on the poop, and the poor fellow was left bruised and breathless and all in a sweat, and unable to comprehend what it was that had happened to him. Don Quixote, when he saw Sancho's flight without wings, asked the general if this was a usual ceremony with those who came on board the galleys for the first time; for, if so, as he had no intention of adopting them as a profession, he had no mind to perform such feats of agility, and if anyone offered to lay hold of him to whirl him about, he vowed to God he would kick his soul out, and as he said this he stood up and clapped his hand upon his sword. At this instant they struck the awning and lowered the yard with a prodigious rattle. Sancho thought heaven was coming off its hinges and going to fall on his head, and full of terror he ducked it and buried it between his knees. Nor were Don Quixote's knees altogether under control, for he too shook a little, squeezed his shoulders together, and lost colour. The crew then hoisted the yard with the same rapidity and clatter as when they lowered it, all the while keeping silence as though they had neither voice nor breath. The boatswain gave the signal to weigh anchor, and leaping upon the middle of the gangway began to lay on to the shoulders of the crew with his courbash or whip, and to haul out gradually to sea. When Sancho saw so many red feet, for such he took the oars to be, moving all together, he said to himself, "It's these that are the real chanted things, and not the ones my master talks of. What can those wretches have done to be so whipped, and how does that one man who goes along there whistling dare to whip so many? I declare this is hell, or at least purgatory." Don Quixote, observing how attentively Sancho regarded what was going on, said to him, "Ah, Sancho, my friend, how quickly and cheaply might you finish off the disenchantment of Dulcinea, if you would strip to the waist and take your place among those gentlemen. Amid the pain and sufferings of so many, you would not feel your own much; and moreover, perhaps the sage Merlin would allow each of these lashes, being laid on with a good hand, to count for 10 of those which you must give yourself at last." The general was about to ask what these lashes were, and what was Dulcinea's disenchantment, when a sailor exclaimed, Maujuis signals that there is an oared vessel off the coast to the west." On hearing this, the general sprang upon the gangway, crying, "Now then, my sons, don't let her give us the slip. It must be some Algerine corsair brigantine that the watchtower signals to us." The 3 others immediately came alongside the chief galley to receive their orders. The general ordered 2 to be put out to sea, while he with the other kept in shore, so that in this way the vessel could not escape them. The crews plied the oars, driving the galleys so furiously that they seemed to fly. The 2 that had put out to sea, after a couple of miles, sighted a vessel which, so far as they could make out, they judged to be one of 14 or 15 banks, and so she proved. As soon as the vessel discovered the galleys, she went about with the object and in the hope of making her escape by her speed, but the attempt failed, for the chief galley was one of the fastest vessels afloat, and overhauled her so rapidly that they on board the brigantine saw clearly there was no possibility of escaping, and the rais therefore would have had them drop their oars and give themselves up, so as not to provoke the captain in command of our galleys to anger. But chance, directing things otherwise, so ordered it that just as the chief galley came close enough for those on board the vessel to hear the shouts from her calling on them to surrender, 2 Toraquis, that is to say 2 Turks, both drunken, that with a dozen more were on board the brigantine, discharged their muskets, killing 2 of the soldiers that lined the sides of our vessel. Seeing this, the general swore that he would not leave one of those he found on board the vessel alive, but as he bore down furiously upon her, she slipped away from him underneath the oars. The galley shot a good way ahead. Those on board the vessel saw their case was desperate, and while the galley was coming about they made sail, and by sailing and rowing once more, tried to sheer off. But their activity did not do them as much good as their rashness did them harm, for the galley coming up with them in a little more than half a mile threw her oars over them and took the whole of them alive. The other 2 galleys now joined company, and all 4 returned with the prize to the beach, where a vast multitude stood waiting for them, eager to see what they brought back. The general anchored close in, and perceived that the viceroy of the city was on the shore. He ordered the skiff to push off to fetch him, and the yard to be lowered for the purpose of hanging forthwith the rais and the rest of the men taken on board the vessel, about 36 in number, all smart fellows, and most of them Turkish musketeers. He asked which was the rais of the brigantine, and was answered in Spanish by one of the prisoners, who afterwards proved to be a Spanish renegade, "This young man, señor, that you see here, is our rais," and he pointed to one of the handsomest and most gallant-looking youths that could be imagined. He did not seem to be 20 years of age. "Tell me, dog," said the general, "what led thee to kill my soldiers, when thou sawest it was impossible for thee to escape? Is that the way to behave to chief galleys? Knowest thou not that rashness is not valor? Faint prospects of success should make men bold, but not rash." The rais was about to reply, but the general could not at that moment listen to him, as he had to hasten to receive the viceroy, who was now coming on board the galley, and with him certain of his attendants and some of the people. "You have had a good chase, señor general," said the viceroy. "Your excellency shall soon see how good, by the game strung up to this yard," replied the general. "How so?" returned the viceroy. "Because," said the general, "against all law, reason, and usages of war, they have killed on my hands 2 of my best soldiers on board these galleys, and I have sworn to hang every man that I have taken, but above all this youth who is the rais of the brigantine," and he pointed to him as he stood with his hands already bound and the rope around his neck, ready for death. The viceroy looked at him, and seeing him so well favored, so graceful, and so submissive, he felt a desire to spare his life, the comeliness of the youth furnishing him at once with a letter of recommendation. He therefore questioned him, saying, "Tell me, rais, art thou Turk, Moor, or renegade?" To which the youth replied, also in Spanish, "I am neither Turk, nor Moor, nor renegade." "What art thou, then?" said the viceroy. "A Christian woman," replied the youth. "A woman and a Christian, in such dress and in such circumstances! It is more marvellous than credible," said the viceroy. "Suspend the execution of the sentence," said the youth. "Your vengeance will not lose much by waiting while I tell you the story of my life." What heart could be so hard as not to be softened by these words, at any rate so far as to listen to what the unhappy youth had to say? The general bade him say what he pleased, but not to expect pardon for his flagrant offence. With this permission the youth began in these words: "Born of Morisco parents, I am of that nation, more unhappy than wise, upon which of late a sea of woes has poured down. In the course of our misfortune I was carried to Barbary by two uncles of mine, for it was in vain that I declared I was Christian, as in fact I am, and not a mere pretended one, or outwardly, but a true Catholic Christian. It availed me nothing with those charged with our sad expatriation to protest this, nor would my uncles believe it. On the contrary, they treated it as an untruth and a subterfuge set up to enable me to remain behind in the land of my birth; and so, more by force than of my own will, they took me with them. I had a Christian mother, and a father who was a man of sound sense, and a Christian too. I imbibed the Catholic faith with my mother's milk. I was well brought up, and neither in word nor in deed did I think, show any sign of being a Morisco. To accompany these virtues, for such I hold them, my beauty, if I possess any, grew with my growth. And great as was the seclusion in which I lived, it was not so great but that a young gentleman, Don Gaspar Gregorio by name, eldest son of a gentleman who is lord of a village near ours, contrived to find opportunities of seeing me. How he saw me, how we met, how his heart was lost to me, and mine not kept from him, would take too long to tell, especially in a moment when I am in dread of the cruel cord that threatens me interposing between tongue and throat. I will only say, therefore, that Don Gregorio chose to accompany me in our banishment. He joined company with the Moriscos, who were going forth from other villages, for he knew their language very well, and on the voyage he struck up a friendship with my two uncles, who were carrying me with them. For my father, like a wise and far-sighted man, as soon as he heard the first edict for our expulsion, quitted the village and departed in quest of some refuge for us abroad. He left hidden and buried, at a spot of which I alone have knowledge, a large quantity of pearls and precious stones of great value, together with a sum of money in gold cruzados and doubloons. He charged me on no account to touch the treasure, if by any chance they expelled us before his return. I obeyed him, and with my uncles, as I have said, and others of our kindred and neighbours, passed over to Barbary, and the place where we took up our abode was Algiers, much the same as if we had taken it up in hell itself. The king heard of my beauty, and report told him of my wealth, which was in some degree fortunate for me. He summoned me before him, and asked me what part of Spain I came from, and what money and jewels I had. I mentioned the place, and told him the jewels and the money were buried there, but that they might easily be recovered if I myself went back for them. All this I told him, in dread lest my beauty and not his own covetousness should influence him. While he was engaged in conversation with me, they brought him word that in company with me was one of the handsomest and most graceful youths that could be imagined. I knew at once that they were speaking of Don Gaspar Gregorio, whose comeliness surpasses the most highly vaunted beauty. I was troubled when I thought of the danger he was in, for among those barbarous Turks a fair youth is more esteemed than a woman, be she ever so beautiful. The king immediately ordered him to be brought before him that he might see him, and asked me if what they said about the youth was true. I then, almost as if inspired by heaven, told him it was, but that I would have him to know it was not a man, but a woman like myself, and I entreated him to allow me to go and dress her in the attire proper to her, so that her beauty might be seen to perfection, and that she might present herself before him with less embarrassment. He bade me go by all means, and said that the next day we should discuss the plan to be adopted for my return to Spain to carry away the hidden treasure. I saw Don Gaspar, I told him the danger he was in if he let it be seen that he was a man. I dressed him as a Moorish woman, and that same afternoon I brought him before the king, who was charmed when he saw him, and resolved to keep the damsel and make a present of her to the Grand Signor, and to avoid the risk she might run among the women of his seraglio, and distrustful of himself, he commanded her to be placed in the house of some Moorish ladies of rank who would protect and attend to her, and thither he was taken at once. What we both suffered, for I cannot deny that I love him, may be left to the imagination of those who are separated if they love one another dearly. The king then arranged that I should return to Spain in this brigantine, and that 2 Turks, those who killed your soldiers, should accompany me. There also came with me this Spanish renegade, and here she pointed to him who had first spoken, whom I know to be secretly a Christian, and to be more desirous of being left in Spain than of returning to Barbary. The rest of the crew of the brigantine are Moors and Turks, who merely serve as rowers. The 2 Turks, greedy and insolent, instead of obeying the orders we had to land me and this renegade in Christian dress, with which we came provided, on the first Spanish ground we came to, chose to run along the coast and make some prize if they could, fearing that if they put us ashore first, we might, in case of some accident befalling us, make it known that the brigantine was at sea, and thus, if there happened to be any galleys on the coast, they might be taken. We sighted this shore last night, and knowing nothing of these galleys, we were discovered, and the result was what you have seen. To sum up, there is Don Gregorio in woman's dress, among women, in imminent danger of his life, and here am I, with hands bound, in expectation, or rather in dread, of losing my life, of which I am already weary. Here, sirs, ends my sad story, as true as it is unhappy. All I ask of you is to allow me to die like a Christian, for, as I have already said, I am not to be charged with the offence of which those of my nation are guilty." And she stood silent, her eyes filled with moving tears, accompanied by plenty from the bystanders. The viceroy, touched with compassion, went up to her without speaking, and untied the cord that bound the hands of the Moorish girl. But all the while the Morisco Christian was telling her strange story, an elderly pilgrim, who had come on board of the galley at the same time as the viceroy, kept his eyes fixed upon her, and the instant she ceased speaking, he threw himself at her feet, and embracing them, said in a voice broken by sobs and sighs, "O Ana Felix, my unhappy daughter! I am thy father, Ricote, come back to look for thee, unable to live without thee, my soul that thou art." At these words of his, Sancho opened his eyes and raised his head, which he had been holding down, brooding over his unlucky excursion, and looking at the pilgrim, he recognized in him that same Ricote he met the day he quitted his government, and felt satisfied that this was his daughter. She being now unbound, embraced her father, mingling her tears with his, while he, addressing the general and the viceroy, said, "This, sirs, is my daughter, more unhappy in her adventures than in her name. She is Ana Felix, surnamed Ricote, celebrated as much for her own beauty as for my wealth. I quitted my native land in search of some shelter or refuge for us abroad, and having found one in Germany, I returned in this pilgrim's dress, in the company of some other German pilgrims, to seek my daughter and take up a large quantity of treasure I had left buried. My daughter I did not find, the treasure I found and have with me, and now, in this strange roundabout way you have seen, I find the treasure that more than all makes me rich, my beloved daughter. If our innocence and her tears and mine can with strict justice open the door to clemency, extend it to us, for we never had any intention of injuring you, nor do we sympathize with the aims of our people, who have been justly banished." "I know Ricote well," said Sancho at this, "and I know too that what he says about Ana Felix being his daughter is true. But as to those other particulars about going and coming, and having good or bad intentions, I say nothing." While all present stood amazed at this strange occurrence, the general said, "At any rate, your tears will not allow me to keep my oath. Live, fair Ana Felix, all the years that heaven has allotted you, but these rash insolent fellows must pay the penalty of the crime they have committed." And with that he gave orders to have the 2 Turks who had killed his 2 soldiers hanged at once at the yard arm. The viceroy, however, begged him earnestly not to hang them, as their behaviour savoured rather of madness than of bravado. The general yielded to the viceroy's request, for revenge is not easily taken in cold blood. They then tried to devise some scheme for rescuing Don Gaspar Gregorio from the danger in which he had been left. Ricote offered for that object more than 2,000 ducats that he had in pearls and gems. They proposed several plans, but none so good as that suggested by the renegade already mentioned, who offered to return to Algiers in a small vessel of about 6 banks, manned by Christian rowers, as he knew where, how, and when he could and should land, nor was he ignorant of the house in which Don Gaspar was staying. The general and the viceroy had some hesitation about placing confidence in the renegade and entrusting him with the Christians who were to row, but Ana Felix said she could answer for him, and her father offered to go and pay the ransom of the Christian if by any chance they should not be forthcoming. This, then, being agreed upon, the viceroy landed, and Don Antonio Moreno took the fair Morisco and her father home with him, the viceroy charging him to give them the best reception and welcome in his power, while on his own part he offered all that house contained for their entertainment, so great was the goodwill and kindliness the beauty of Ana Felix had infused into his heart. Chapter 64. Treating of the adventure which gave Don Quixote more unhappiness than all that had hitherto befallen him. The wife of Don Antonio Moreno, so the history says, was extremely happy to see Ana Felix in her house. She welcomed her with great kindness, charmed as well by her beauty as by her intelligence, for in both respects the fair Morisco was richly endowed, and all the people of the city flocked to see her, as though they had been summoned by the ringing of the bells. Don Quixote told Don Antonio that the plan adopted for releasing Don Gregorio was not a good one, for its risks were greater than its advantages, and that it would be better to land himself with his arms and horse in Barbary, for he would carry him off in spite of the whole Moorish host, as Don Gaiferos carried off his wife Melisendra. "Remember, your worship," observed Sancho on hearing him say so, "Señor Don Gaiferos carried off his wife from the mainland, and took her to France by land. But in this case, if by chance we carry off Don Gregorio, we have no way of bringing him to Spain, for there's the sea between." "There's a remedy for everything except death," said Don Quixote. "If they bring the vessel close to the shore, we shall be able to get on board though all the world strive to prevent us." "Your worship hits it off mighty well and mighty easy," said Sancho, "but it's a long step from saying to doing, and I hold to the renegade, for he seems to be an honest good-hearted fellow." Don Antonio then said that if the renegade did not prove successful, the expedient of the great Don Quixote's expedition to Barbary should be adopted. 2 days afterwards the renegade put to sea in a light vessel of 6 oars a side manned by a stout crew, and 2 days later the galleys made sail eastward, the general having begged the viceroy to let him know all about the release of Don Gregorio and about Ana Felix, and the viceroy promised to do as he requested. One morning as Don Quixote went out for a stroll along the beach, arrayed in full armour, for, as he often said, that was his only gear, his only rest in the fray, and he never was without it for a moment, he saw coming towards him a knight also in full armour, with a shining moon painted on his shield, who, on approaching sufficiently near to be heard, said in a loud voice, addressing himself to Don Quixote, "Illustrious knight and never sufficiently extolled Don Quixote of La Mancha, I am the Knight of the White Moon, whose unheard of achievements will perhaps have recalled him to thy memory. I come to do battle with thee and prove the might of thy arm, to the end that I make thee acknowledge and confess that my lady, let her be who she may, is incomparably fairer than thy Dulcinea del Toboso. If thou dost acknowledge this fairly and openly, thou shalt escape death and save me the trouble of inflicting it upon thee. If thou fightest and I vanquish thee, I demand no other satisfaction than that, laying aside arms and abstaining from going in quest of adventures, thou withdraw and betake thyself to thine own village for the space of a year, and live there without putting hand to sword, in peace and quiet and beneficial repose, the same being needful for the increase of thy substance and the salvation of thy soul. And if thou dost vanquish me, my head shall be at thy disposal, my arms and horse thy spoils, and the renown of my deeds transferred and added to thine. Consider which will be thy best course, and give me thy answer speedily, for this day is all the time I have for the dispatch of this business." Don Quixote was amazed and astonished, as well at the Knight of the White Moon's arrogance, as at his reason for delivering the defiance, and with calm dignity he answered him, "Knight of the White Moon, of whose achievements I have never heard until now, I will venture to swear that you have never seen the illustrious Dulcinea, for had you seen her I know you would have taken care not to venture yourself upon this issue, because the sight would have removed all doubt from your mind that there ever has been nor can be a beauty to be compared with hers; and so, not saying you lie, but merely that you are not correct in what you state, I accept your challenge, with the conditions you have proposed, and at once, that the day you have fixed may not expire. And from your conditions I accept only that of the renown of your achievements being transferred to me, for I know not of what sort they are, nor what they may amount to. I am satisfied with my own, such as they be. Take, therefore, the side of the field you choose, and I will do the same, and to whom God shall give it may Saint Peter add his blessing." The Knight of the White Moon had been seen from the city, and it was told the viceroy how he was in conversation with Don Quixote. The viceroy, fancying it must be some fresh adventure got up by Don Antonio Moreno, or some other gentleman of the city, hurried out at once to the beach accompanied by Don Antonio and several other gentlemen, just as Don Quixote was wheeling Rocinante around in order to take up the necessary distance. The viceroy upon this, seeing that the pair of them were evidently preparing to come to the charge, put himself between them, asking them what it was that led them to engage in combat all of a sudden in this way. The Knight of the White Moon replied that it was a question of precedence of beauty, and briefly told him what he had said to Don Quixote, and how the conditions of the defiance agreed upon on both sides had been accepted. The viceroy went over to Don Antonio and asked in a low voice did he know who the Knight of the White Moon was, or was it some joke they were playing on Don Quixote? Don Antonio replied that he neither knew who he was, nor whether the defiance was in joke or in earnest. This answer left the viceroy in a state of perplexity, not knowing whether he ought to let the combat go on or not. But unable to persuade himself that it was anything but a joke, he fell back, saying, "If there be no other way out of it, gallant knights, except to confess or die, and Don Quixote is inflexible, and your worship of the White Moon still more so, in God's hand be it, and fall on." He of the White Moon thanked the viceroy in courteous and well-chosen words for the permission he gave them, and so did Don Quixote, who then, commending himself with all his heart to heaven and to his Dulcinea, as was his custom on the eve of any combat that awaited him, proceeded to take a little more distance, as he saw his antagonist was doing the same. Then, without blast of trumpet or other warlike instrument to give them the signal to charge, both at the same instant wheeled their horses, and he of the White Moon, being the swifter, met Don Quixote after having traversed 2/3 of the course, and there encountered him with such violence that, without touching him with his lance, for he held it high, to all appearance purposely, he hurled Don Quixote and Rocinante to the earth, a perilous fall. He sprang upon him at once, and placing the lance over his visor, said to him, "You are vanquished, Sir Knight, nay, dead, unless you admit the conditions of our defiance." Don Quixote, bruised and stupefied, without raising his visor, said in a weak feeble voice, as if he were speaking out of a tomb, "Dulcinea del Toboso is the fairest woman in the world, and I the most unfortunate knight on earth. It is not fitting that this truth should suffer by my feebleness. Drive your lance home, Sir Knight, and take my life, since you have taken away my honour." "That I will not, in sooth," said he of the White Moon. "Live the fame of the Lady Dulcinea's beauty undimmed as ever. All I require is that the great Don Quixote retire to his own home for a year, or for so long a time as shall by me be enjoined upon him, as we agreed before engaging in this combat." The viceroy, Don Antonio, and several others who were present, heard all this, and heard too how Don Quixote replied that so long as nothing in prejudice of Dulcinea was demanded of him, he would observe all the rest like a true and loyal knight. The engagement given, he of the White Moon wheeled about, and making obeisance to the viceroy with a movement of the head, rode away into the city at a half gallop. The viceroy bade Don Antonio hasten after him, and by some means or other find out who he was. They raised Don Quixote up and uncovered his face, and found him pale and bathed with sweat. Rocinante, from the mere hard measure he had received, lay unable to stir for the present. Sancho, wholly dejected and woebegone, knew not what to say or do. He fancied that all was a dream, that the whole business was a piece of enchantment. Here was his master defeated, and bound not to take up arms for a year. He saw the light of the glory of his achievements obscured. The hopes of the promises lately made him swept away like smoke before the wind. Rocinante, he feared, was crippled for life, and his master's bones out of joint; for if he were only shaken out of his madness, it would be no small luck. In the end they carried him into the city in a hand chair, which the viceroy sent for, and thither the viceroy himself returned, eager to ascertain who this Knight of the White Moon was, who had left Don Quixote in such a sad plight. End of chapters 63 and 64.